Hello and welcome. It's Grant Asplund here again. Joining me, my good friend Mike Lopez, Director of Cloud Services at Access IT Group. It's wonderful to see you again, Mike.
Good to see you, buddy. How are you?
Yeah, good, man. Good. So I think we've been doing a pretty good job knocking down what's commonly maybe overlooked or just common weak spots that organizations are experiencing. I know, the first session we kind of talked about on-prem and the differences and challenges. We've went through three of them, and today we're going to talk about what I think is probably the most common headline, at least in terms of asset, maybe not always in the best light, and that is S3 or storage, and more specifically, the breach of storage. So what is it? Why is this happening so much? Why is it over and over? I mean, all you have to do is go to Google and search for S3 breach, blah breach, storage breach in the cloud, what have you, and they're all over. What gives?
Well, unfortunately, this goes back to what we talked about in the first episode. It's a matter of configurability and misconfiguration. Understanding the different controls that are in place. For a long time, AWS S3 buckets came up by default as public. Well, if you didn't know that, you didn't realize that this entire asset, this entire whatever you're putting there, could be accessible to the entire world. People were not putting access control rules. They weren't necessarily understanding this. And it wasn't because they were malicious with their intent. It wasn't that they were bad at their jobs. They just didn't understand the new toys that they were playing with. And they had to learn them. And obviously, we've seen that time and time again with breach, not only from Amazon S3 misconfigurations, but blob storage misconfigurations.
Right.
How can you access it? It's the first question, but you got to pay attention.
So is it, I mean, it seems like, I'm a Gilligan, Mike, so, you got to give me a little bit of room, but it seems like this has something to do with some of the previous things we've talked about, right? Identity and access management, role-based access controls. Aren't these sort of related?
Well, it absolutely does that. It even wraps visibility in, who can access what and from where and how. Right. Who's going to be able to, what machine? We talked about the identity and how machines can assume. Take a native, we'll use S3, for example, a native system that's used by a lot of AWS users. CloudTrail is going to dump your logs into an S3 bucket. Well, great. Well, who can access those, though? Well, you don't want the whole world being able to get to them for sure. You don't want your entire organization being able to check logs. Who needs to be able to see them? And we can define that by setting our access control list, by setting our bucket policy. And you'll see that access control lists have actually been deprecated by AWS. By setting a bucket policy, you can define exactly what action it takes and can be taken on that bucket. And as we discussed before, we can ask and get granular with these specific details. Can we read it? Yes. Can we delete? No. It's very simple. But we have to take those steps. We have to ask the right questions, really, is what it comes down to.
Boy, and I'm just sitting here thinking, and I failed actually to even hit on this in some of the previous episodes that we've talked, but I've got to believe with, the data points to in excess of 90% of companies are using multi-cloud, right? They're not just all on a pogo stick. So I got to believe this becomes just exponentially more difficult, as does the previous things we've talked about: identity, configuring properly, having visibility across all those clouds, because they're lumpy, aren't they? I mean, they're not exactly the same.
Well, they're definitely not the same, and the different things that you can do with them varies. I mean, just take Azure in and of itself. A storage account. Okay, well, what's that contain? Are we using blob storage? Are we using Azure file shares? What are we actually putting there? There's a lot of different things that can be done, and it's still considered blob storage. How are we protecting it? What's our default access rule to it? Well, it kind of matters, and you got to understand the different nuances and how they can be accessed, what things can be done with them to really understand what can be done. And it's different, right? AWS, not going to be able to do the same things with an S3 bucket that you can do with blob storage. So understanding the differences is vital.
Yeah, well, and I've said many, many times, and I think most people know but sometimes we kind of have to remind ourselves that, yeah, they're all climbing the public cloud provider mountain, but they're definitely taking different paths because they have different baggage, right? I mean, you know, the Sherpas that are carrying Microsoft up the mountain, they're carrying a lot of Active Directory and a lot of that stuff that aren't on the backs of those coming from Amazon, right? So there's just some very now that's not to say that that doesn't provide arguably a Trojan horse in some instances for Microsoft, right? Same with Office, but it's very interesting how when you start to employ more than one, and that's where, you know, it's on you, because I'm sure neither of the two aforementioned vendors are running to your side to make it easy for you to harmonize them together, right?
No, most certainly not. I mean, they behave entirely different. I mean, it's really the different side of the mountain, and one side's got snow on it, and the other side's a desert. You know, they really are entirely different in the way they behave, and you know, it's gonna be a different climb, especially when you're asked to jump from side to side of the mountain, and that makes it
Right.
even more challenging. You know, that's where you have to start relying on infrastructure as code, and you have to start relying on your DevOps to be able to deploy things in automation so that they're all meeting your standards, that these are predefined guidelines. And when we do spin up a storage account, it's going to have X, Y, and Z automatically. When we spin up an S3 bucket, we've got policies, whether it be service control policies, however you're doing in your environment, but we can control how that spins up, and we can make sure we're protected.
Yep, got it. Awesome. All right, so we're nailing them here, man. I appreciate it. We've kind of been just knocking these down. I'm really looking forward to our next session, because, you know, everybody kind of sees this as the panacea, but I think there's a little Swiss cheese out there in how it's managed. We'll talk about that on the next session. Thanks very much, Mike.
See you next time.
You bet.